Hi, and welcome back to episode 2 of our History of Zero Trust podcast. My name is James Tucker, CISO for EMEA, and I'm joined here by Martyn.
Thank you, James. Martyn Ditchburn, CTO in residence here at Zscaler. And it's really great to be back to, evolve our earlier conversation on, the history of Zero Trust and really get into the details of, how did it rise? How did it come to be? And, what kind of comes next?
In this episode, the title is The Rise of Zero Trust. And we'll be talking about things that we've seen in more recent time and also what we're seeing out there in the customer interactions and the organizations we're helping today. Martyn, when you think about the title, The Rise of Zero Trust, what comes to mind?
For me, it's all about the point that Zero Trust became a household name, a buzzword, if you want, industry recognized.
So marketing is plays a very powerful role in sort of getting the latest and greatest products out there. But I think the real emergence of Zero Trust, or at least the mainstream adoption of it, was really kind of the COVID experience, right? And COVID was different for every organization and every individual who experienced it. But there were some common themes around helping organizations continue to operate. Whether you were a key worker or whether you were an office administration worker. The goal was that the countries and the organizations had to continue to operate. So this presented a series of challenges for IT organizations everywhere. I certainly remember sitting in the war room of my previous organization, figuring out how we were going to get several thousand individuals onto our corporate environment and to the applications and the data they need to do their jobs in a way that was at a scale that we needed. In the past, we used to have perhaps 10% of the organization working from home at any given time. And almost overnight, we were given that challenge of rising the organization count to 100%. I've heard that described as going from like 5,000 people offices to 15,000 one-person offices over the course of a weekend.
Right. And I think we've got a lot of things to thank for that sort of journey. So there's a lot of critical technology events that had to happen. So first of all, internet had to become the mainstream. So we had to go from the dial-up medium to something that was more broadband sort of capable. So of course, we can thank the emergence of Netflix and all those streaming services for that. But of course, then we had sort of adopt a cultural acceptance of working from home. For many decades, it was quite a stigma if you were taking your work home. It almost felt or seemed as if you were inferior. Like we all see those sort of comedy sketches where, the person is too sick to work, to work in the office right now or to go home. And I think that's, a cultural norm. And I think the emergence of cloud was the last critical component. The idea that we could call on resources at, infinite scale to us at the point we needed it was a critical pivot point. I mean, I remember sitting in, with my data center groups, working out how we were going to deploy all the VPN head-ins we needed. And then we had the desktop support teams who were trying to figure out, well, with all of those VPN head-ins, there's multiple front doors. How did we educate the user into connecting to the right one so the user experience was to the right level? So I think the emergence, or at least the mainstream adoption of Zero Trust, came from this, critical need to continue to work. They sort of say necessity is the mother of invention.
I know personally a lot of organizations that I worked with where the technical people were saying, we need to do this for maybe 2 years. And I had a very frank conversation with somebody who said, I'm so happy that they sent everybody home because I can finally do the things I need. And it was sort of like a cheat code in a lot of ways to do some of the things that have been talked about for at least 2-3 years prior to the pandemic. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that would be fair to say. And I think COVID gave a lot of IT organizations permission to throw out the rule book. I think over the years, the criticality of IT services had come to the point that we'd all become a bit risk adverse, right? So project would take years to implement. And I think if COVID hadn't have happened, we'd probably still reach the Zero Trust end state, but it probably would have taken another 3 to 5 years.
So we've reached the Zero Trust end state?
Certainly not the end state, but I guess a point where organizations are willing to entertain new technologies. Like I said, risk is, an important part of, operating businesses, right? We all want to make sure there's a predictable level of income. And of course, that means that your connectivity services have got to be rock solid. So experimenting with something that perhaps wasn't as well known would be something that most CEOs would shy away from. But COVID really changed that thinking because it was a fail fast, try anything, spend anything.
The default option wasn't an option.
Right, that's it. They had to operate. Failure wasn't an option.
So you talked about VPN there, but why not just expand out VPN during that time?
Yeah, I think there was a number of events that sort of came along that certainly helped make my decisions around sort of VPN. So one was really around just operational management, right? How are we going to deploy those VPN headends? We didn't have an army of IT engineers to go out in every country and every location to add, an infinite number of endpoints. And bearing in mind, we'd never operated at that scale before. Like I said, 10% of the organization were working from home at any given time.
That's only a 90% discrepancy.
Right. We had some idea.
YOLO.
That's right. And the price of getting it wrong was just way too high. The second one was really around the lack of availability of hardware. Right. I mean,
all the supply chain.
Right. Yeah. The supply chains completely crumbled. Silicon became like an all-time availability low. Prices were rising. It was a bit like, if you think about the COVID experience, the availability of PPE, the VPN was the equivalent of PPE for most organizations. It was almost unavailable, right? You couldn't get it because of the demand. Prices were rising. And even if you could get it, you had no one who was allowed out to go into those locations.
As a nerd, I'm going to switch out PPE with graphics cards, but that's just my touch point there. Impossible to get. But yeah, I hear you. So the combination between, hey, we need to just send everybody home and we can't use the default option, right? You've heard me rail on VPNs at length before. And given all the context we talked about, the internal trust or the implicit trust in the first episode, the fundamental problem is it's not a connector to an app. It is a virtual private network. How do I take this computer and connect it to that network over there with all of the trust, all of the access as if I was sitting there, which is definitely not what you want if you're actually trying to secure. Because I think one element that you didn't talk about is now that we've sent all those people home, right? We're not just worrying about their computer, right? Their laptop. You're worried about, they had their kids who were bored home, right? They're streaming stuff, they're downloading, they're doing, all the stuff. I've got 3 kids. I know what they can get up to. And as a CISO, my attack surface went from not just the devices that I have and the network that I have, but to all of the devices attached to everybody's home. I don't want to have to think about the risk profile of your smart fridge when you go home and connect. And that element of trust that we talked about a lot in the first episode, but that element of trust and bringing that into, okay, now everything's broken, we have to rethink, I think was the match that lit a lot of zero trust progress in terms of, that was what got those projects started because the default was no longer an option.
That's right. And I think the technology capabilities, with VPN had a different tolerance level sort of back then. I think the occasional day of somebody working from home, everybody accepted that a slight performance degradation was an acceptable trade-off to, that privilege of working from home. But when you're doing it, every day, day in, day out, that level of performance becomes more critical. So IT organizations were doing a few things to help balance that, reduce that sort of friction. And one of those was split tunneling, right? So split tunneling created that situation where...
Just humor me here. Can you explain split tunneling a little bit?
Sure. So this is the concept where we're taking the communication pipe and we're splitting it into 2 parts. There is the part that the user will use to communicate back to their private applications, their corporate applications. But for anything else that perhaps was more internet driven, it would go straight out of their closest, internet exit gateway.
Their home router, in this case, yeah.
And that was all driven by performance. That was quite a tolerable situation for the most part. But as security officers started to grapple with the fact that their users were outside of those walls that we talked about before. But malware and threats were on the rise, right? At the point that the world needed to be stable and be remote and work remote is the same point that the criminal organization decided they were going to exploit that opportunity. So we saw this huge rise of sort of threats and sort of malware. Yes, so this was kind of happening at the same time IT teams are kind of grappling with the idea of people working from home. So we had this coalition of almost a perfect storm, which was getting people out to access the organization in a way that we're tearing up the rule book, but at the same time we're still trying to protect the organization from all the bad threats and all the bad things that were out there. And to your earlier point, we're now dealing with networks that are completely foreign to us. We had situations where neighbors were sharing Wi-Fi. So it wasn't just the people that we knew in our organization, but it was their neighbors. And those are unknown factors.
I'm assuming anybody who's sharing their Wi-Fi with their neighbors does not have security as one of their top 10 priorities.
Right. And I remember situations where there just wasn't enough laptops to go around. And in fact, people were sharing devices. And that worked in sort of two directions. We had people unable to work, so they had to sort of share devices. Perhaps they left their devices in the office. They had to use their home. But also, to your earlier comment, they had their kids at home, right? And not every family can afford multiple devices for every person in the household. So you had this situation where we had threats coming from the internet, but also we had threats coming from internally because of the sheer number of people that would use the same device depending on the time of day.
Mm-hmm. So with that as kind of the rocket fuel that I remember working with a customer who was supposed to test 400 users. We did that on a Thursday. And then when I came in Monday to check the progress, there were 18,000 users. And when I called, they said, yeah, it seemed to work and we need to go fast. So that kind of mindset, which I mean is a dream from a technical standpoint and is a bit of a nightmare from an organizational and a security standpoint because things can get missed. Though, what do you think about zero trust in terms of reducing the overall risk profile for organizations in the scenario we've just described?
Yes. So my organization was quite fortunate that we'd chosen a zero trust strategy probably about 6 to 8 months before. So we were sort of in a position where we had grappled with the fundamentals. So we had connectors out there. We'd done some work around users purposefully connecting to applications. But for a lot of organizations, that wasn't really the case. There was a great fear around how we were going to purposefully connect an individual just to their applications. So I think a lot of organizations decided that they would, embrace it in quite a generic sense. So perhaps a more tactical idea that they were going to embrace the principles of cloud scale and get those users principally working before they dealt with the challenges of security. And I think that was a great galvanizer to, teams working together. I know that the network teams that I sort of, had under my sort of control had never really worked with the security teams in the way that they did during COVID. That sort of hand-in-hand partnership was critical to that sort of success and making sure that those threats that we were seeing on the rise didn't translate into, challenges inside the organization.
So it sounds like you were doing a lot of the hard work. What I see in a lot of cases is organizations want to go to zero trust for diverse reasons we'll dig into in a minute, but they are so keen to get there that they don't stop and do that kind of hard work of saying, why are we doing this? What's the North Star? What's the business outcomes? How is this going to help us make more widgets or make our employees more productive? What was the North Star for your organization?
Yeah, I think the reality is that organizations think about zero trust as being too big. So if COVID has, taught us anything at all, is that there was one purpose, which was to get your workforce, connected. So perhaps that's just really where you start, right? So when I hear organizations talking about we're embracing a zero trust strategy, that's great. But what is the reason behind that? What's the first step? So for me, my zero trust journey started with accelerated mergers and acquisitions. The idea that we could unpick this kind of bird's nest of IP addressing and kind of routing tables, which were always a challenge for us. One of the things that network providers did a really great job of over the years was teaching people how to build networks. The problem is they taught them all to build it exactly the same way. So we had IP address challenges, pretty much every time we wanted to do mergers and acquisitions. So this idea of a proxy-based architecture really propelled us into this position where we didn't really care where people were. We didn't have to bridge networks in order to sort of achieve this. But it was a singular purpose, which was join two organizations together that had never really been sort of joined without sort of joining the networks together, which of course for many is the end state. When you think about network segmentation, the starting point of mergers and acquisitions is almost like the desired end state, which is you have people working without having all that lateral movement. So for me, it's really about unpacking one use case at a time. So through one use case of mergers and acquisitions, it started to help me understand that I could actually do cafe-style ways of working. I could change the VDI usage in the organization, right? So we 808 on that use case. I could reduce my DMZ exposure. I think over the years, I tried every technology available. I tried VPN, I tried VDI, I tried app streaming. And then you had sort of challenges either around exposing more than you'd like on the internet or leaning into those technology challenges around IP addressing and all those networking kind of things.
That's one of the problems I have with VPNs is that in order to provide that access, you have to have something out there publicly on the internet, which as a CISO who is paranoid about most things and thinks about everything in terms of risk, I don't want my front door to be sitting there for anybody to knock. I mean, as we're recording this, there is recently a huge string of new vulnerabilities for VPNs coming out every week now. And that attack surface, the smaller I can make those variables, the more successful I'm going to be. So as you're talking about that kind of that motivation, that North Star in there, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask a lot of people. Because I think when people decide to go zero trust, they think of it as an all or nothing game, right? Yes, we're going zero trust. And then the projects get stuck because they say, yeah, but we have this 10% of our hosts that we can't do. We've got this 30-year-old server in the basement. We've got this edge case. So, there's this whole 20% of things that we can't do. And I'll ask you a very loaded question, but what percentage of an organization needs to be zero trustified in order for that organization to consider it a success and see benefits?
Yeah, I think every step is a benefit. And I think focusing on your user base is probably a really great place to start, because I think over 90% of vulnerabilities come into an organization through the user base, not usually with intent, but just accidental, just course of, doing day to day. Malware is getting better by the day. Phishing attacks are getting more complex and, more effective. So, of course, focusing on the users, I think, is really where you start. But
I think start with your biggest problem first.
Start with the biggest problem, but in one specific place. So for me, like I said, it was one part of the organization who we were joining together. But it was quickly, we quickly evolved that from the M&A use case into what does the third-party supply chain look like? How do we tackle those users? How do we deal with our new offices in, say, China, for example? And I think if organizations structure it in, with a bigger goal in mind, but take those incremental steps, it's far more effective and more real world. I think, if we take a typical organization, you could run a project that does this thing called zero trust. Or you could take the guardrails, the fundamentals of zero trust adoption, and you could bake it into the laptop refresh cycle, for example. You could bake it into how the office is going to look like as part of an office refresh cycle. So it becomes much more manageable. And in fact, you end up with multiple teams adopting it in parallel, but almost autonomously to the end state of kind of zero trust.
Based on talking to customers, right? If I ask what percentage of your organization should be zero trust, and by zero trust, I mean users or initiators of any sort. I don't care if it's a workload or if it's an IoT device or a physical person, should only have access to the applications and services that we explicitly grant them, right? Avoiding that implicit trust that we talked about in episode 1. And what I've seen in talking to customers is that 20%, you're going to see a risk reduction. If you just get 20% of your organization, say the traveling users or the users who work with the most sensitive type of data. I also think 100% is a little ambitious, maybe Don Quixote tilting at windmills kind of level of delusion, because unless you and I and the film crew here go start a company tomorrow, and we have a couple of MacBooks with a lot of stickers, because you got to have stickers if we're a startup, and an AWS account, Zero Trust is easy.
It is. And I think you've got to, I guess, embrace the idea that Zero Trust isn't something you buy. It's a philosophy. It's something that you do. And we know that technology evolves all the time. So it's very easy to conclude that it's going to be an ever evolving, or unfolding kind of story. So to your point, you've got to start somewhere. So I always like to think of it as the 80-20 rule. 80% of users use 20% of the corporate apps. Certainly in my experience, that was true. So just taking those 20% of apps means that you can deploy a zero trust mechanism to almost 80% of the organization. Now, that's a huge step change just by focusing on something that's more targeted and more real. And those 20%, could be your crown jewels app. So even if you start there, that's a very significant and meaningful change to the organization.
Where I see people fail is not in the desire to do it. It's in, okay, but why are we doing it? What's the benefit? And Zero Trust doesn't just touch on the networking team or the security team. It's the application team. It's the desktop support team. All of these teams need to understand that if we do this, which is generally not like a magic switch overnight kind of thing, if we do this, there is a promised land on the other side where we're not going to be staying at work until 10 p.m. on a Friday trying to detox the network from ransomware.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to zero trust adoption as part of a strategic intent, I always like to think of it as following the money, right? Why does our organization exist? It's not really to run IT. It's to serve the customers in the best way possible and deliver competitive advantage or better sort of services. So really, ultimately, we're trying to serve the needs of our customer base. So if you think of zero trust as being an enabler to those things, whether it's moving to cloud as part of a digital acceleration, or whether you're looking at making data more available for the next level of sort of product, the next generation of competitive advantage, it's very easy to see how a zero trust thinking is going to align quite naturally to the boardroom.
I think that boardroom alignment is really key. We spend so much time talking about zero trust, and we sort of assume that everybody knows what this concept is. However, in certain circles, if it's, sort of half understood, it's this thing that the nerds want because, I don't know, it's shiny and it does stuff I don't understand. And the marriage between the business outcomes and the security outcomes and all of the optimization that Zero Trust can provide, right? Not only can I make sure that, when you're working from home, you're using the right path and still being secure, that you only have access to the applications that I want you to, that I'm not letting you cheat and write your podcast script using ChatGPT.
Right. And I think there's one, powerful thing that, zero trust adoption projects have that perhaps earlier IT projects didn't have. And that's really the invention of the cloud. I remember a time sitting in the boardroom where we couldn't imagine a world where our data would ever leave, the organization.
You got to keep it in the basement.
Right. But guess what? 5 years later, we were all in. So of course, boards are now, they recognize the importance of cloud. So if a company sort of phrases the idea of moving its communication and its security to the cloud, that's something that's much better understood than it ever was before. So boards are more willing to accept it because they understand the power of cloud on demand, scale when you kind of need
accepting the change, right? I think we in the security side, we're often seen as the people who say no, right? No, you can't connect here. No, you can't go to this website. And there is a fundamental shift powered by all of the lessons we learned through COVID, to go to an earlier point, that, oh, wait a minute, these nerds can make the business go faster and help us achieve these objectives and, outpace the competition by reducing that internal friction?
Yeah, I think it's really about the art of saying yes. And I think that's something that the security teams have come to understand, which was their job used to be to secure the organization. And now it's very much an idea of, well, how do we help the organization do business, but safely?
Right. The business aspect, I think, is something we see a lot more. Very rarely do I see the CISO not being invited to present to the board these days. Right. We used to have to go sit at the children's table while the real executives talked. And now we're to pluses and minuses being, asked to present because of all of the compliance issues that we see, which I guess we haven't really dug into at all.
Yeah. So COVID was a great accelerator to get IT in the boardroom. And now, execs are they have their ears open. An organization that used zero trust to overcome those connectivity challenges, the architecture gives them a real advantage now. So this proxy-based architecture means they now have a single central point where the control and sort of the visibility kind of happens. Well, guess what? If you have that single point, it's very natural to take the data points that come from that central point and put it into data that...
The average organization, I think, has something like 200 to 300 different security tools, right? If you also have, what did we say, 15,000 networks earlier, right? How do you possibly reconcile that and say, this is our risk level, we're this secure? It's impossible. So I think to your point of minimizing the amount of those, the amount of variables you have in your risk calculations by also improving user experience and all the things we talked to briefly. I'm thinking a lot and working a lot with our customers on compliance towards a lot of these new like NIS2 and DORA. And both of those explicitly mention zero trust as, and I don't know, I joke about it a lot, but it calls it basic cybersecurity. And I'm pretty sure that whoever did that has never tried to implement zero trust in an organization that was only marginally willing. But it is becoming part of what is expected for organizations to deliver today, and the mindset of, hey, maybe we shouldn't just bang everybody on a network and hope for the best and install some antivirus and call it a day.
Yeah, I mean, completely. I mean, it was well known that the boards would say that they would have the best security they could afford. And that's been true for, decades. As physical appliances, the point in time that you bought them, they could only have certain capabilities, and it was very rare you could upgrade them to any meaningful sort of way. That idea of embracing cloud helped overcome those sort of challenges, created that visibility that we sort of talked about, and made that data more accessible to make data-driven decisions to an organization. But the other advantage of kind of cloud, as we, really sort of inspect it, is that the heavy lifting is done for you. As data center groups, we're well used to that technology that used to be a physical server, moving to virtual, now moving over to cloud. That heavy lifting was done, by other teams. And that's something that the security function can now take full advantage of, right? There are, armies of people who are aligning zero trust features and services to the latest compliance. And that's translating into a very real and measurable set of data points that you can take into the boardroom and you can show, measurable change. I certainly remember a time where we wanted to turn on, TLS inspection of our firewalls, and I think they hit about 30% before they sort of collapsed. So of course, then we decided it was just too hard. Mm-hmm. But, with cloud capabilities, that's much more accessible. And it's not just accessible to those who can, the top end who can afford it, right? The banks, etc. It's accessible to, everybody, right? Whether you're a startup all the way through. And I think that's one of the powerful changes, not just for cloud, but the accessibilities of zero trust.
So I'm going to take one last swing back towards compliance, this dark alley that we call compliance, because, and I'm going to take one last swing towards this dark alley we call compliance. As I mentioned, the new versions of compliance, NIS2, DORA, there's the SEC rules. They all pretty much talk about zero trust. And there's an interesting thought that I had, and I want to get your view on it, which is you used to be able to be compliant on paper, but not in your security would still be garbage, right? You can go through and check all those boxes. Do you think it's possible to fake zero trust in organization?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I sort of refer back to to a colleague I recently worked with, who works in one of the healthcare kind of services, and he was saying that zero trust removed the places to hide. So everybody kind of declared on paper that they were 100% compliant, but as we know, there are always the edge cases that perhaps aren't where we want them to be, and we're accepting those kind of risks. But that sort of central visibility piece means that those places to hide are being reduced, and I think that works in two ways. It could either scare us into, I guess, taking action, right? We can request money from the boards, etc. But the other place it can sort of take us is to one of, risk, not risk acceptance, but more of a...
There is nothing without risk.
No, I know.
So you always have to accept some sort of risk. But I think if I'm understanding your train of thought, it's towards having a better visibility and a better kind of realistic assessment of what that risk actually is today, and then being able to make smart decisions as to how you compensate for that risk.
Right. The data points matter. If we take our services that are more internet facing, it's logical to conclude those are the things that we'd focus on our security posture first, because they're the ones that are more accessible to someone who would do us harm. That doesn't mean you want to ignore those resources, at the back end where perhaps they're not visible to the internet. But it's a very real thing that we don't have armies of people behind us. So, zero trust does two great things. One is it creates that visibility in terms of comprehensive sort of protection. But two, it allows us to focus our resources on the elements that matter, that will create most impact.
I'm just going to summarize the things we've talked over the past 20, 25 minutes. So we talked about how COVID was, for all the terrible things that COVID did, in a lot of ways, when it comes to the adoption of zero trust, it was an accelerator. It forced us to kind of, as you said, rip up the rule books and throw away the way we've been doing things, and forced a change. And what we're seeing today is a lot of companies who are trying to buy a zero trust. And zero trust isn't a service. It's more of a philosophy that you need to employ in your organizations.
Right.
You got to have that North Star, why we're doing it, and tie it into the business value. The next thing that you talked about was, hey, where do I start?
Right. And I think aligning that value to a series of steps that allows the organization to grow and be successful is always going to resonate well in the boardroom. And it is probably the first time in a long time that IT has matched up well to the aspirations of growing businesses.
And I think with that, that's a perfect stopping point for this episode. So thank you for the conversation so far, Martyn. And thank you to anybody who's watching or listening to this. Please join us for episode 3, where we're going to be talking about what the future of zero trust might hold and the kind of problems that Martyn and I are going to be losing our hair over the next 10 to 15 years.
Some of us are ahead of others, James.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.